So when I met Stepan, his idea of Hubtopia resonated a lot for me. And so, in the sense that I had an angle that was very driven by network science. And when he invited me for a contribution, I was like, oh, that's perfect, so that I can actually talk to him about that, so that he can get a lot of knowledge from the field. Alors, okay, so that's just to make a draft, and I was expecting maybe more people that are very, very not aware of hubs, but I wanted to ask what is a hub for you? So, like, what is a hub? Can you give me names? What does that evoke for you, a hub?
Like a transportation hub.
Transportation hub? Okay, like an airport, for example?
Yes, for example.
Okay, so like special thing. Another
Social media.
Social media, okay, so like social networks.
Where the wheel attaches to the axle.
That's
where it comes from, the word. Right? It's the center of the wheel.
It's the center of the wheel.
Yeah.
Okay, so this one I didn't know. Okay, so I asked to Google because I knew nothing. Okay, and so for Google, it's actually a way to connect computers. And that's not so far from what I'm going to show you. It's a way to connect indeed. And everything that you said is super relevant, and so we're going to see a bit all the flavors of the hubs. So first, I wanted to give kind of, before diving into the history of network science, I wanted to give just a few words about why in the world now everybody's talking about network and why is network interesting. So I'm a physicist, and I began my path in cosmology. And cosmology in physics, it's really the epitome of physics. You study space and time. You study the evolution of the universe in time. And it's everything that has been done in physics is about looking at basically the evolution of things in time. So it's really related to that stuff of the universe. And the thing with networks is that there's an addition on top of that, which is how things link. So this is basically what you're seeing here is the network of galaxies. So it's how there's a link between two galaxies if they're at a certain distance to each other. And so the little point is actually the galaxy, but the mass around the galaxy, which is dark matter, can be very big. And in itself, this thing makes no sense because that network doesn't exist. It's just pure distance. It's just pure space. But however, if you were, for example, to travel the universe to say you want your civilization and you want to conquer the whole galaxy, the whole universe, what you would want to do is to stop at some point to take some resource, refuel, etc., and then go to the next one. So you would need a map. And I think that's interesting to take that as a first step, is that the network is something imaginary. The network doesn't exist. But it's a map to navigate things. It's something that has a meaning. It has a function, and it has to be seen in the sense of fulfilling that function. And that's something that is very different from usual physics, that is just mere evolution in space and time. The network contains information. It's not something real, it's something we use to describe a system with a function. So another example where looking into networks makes sense. So this is a blackout in 2003 in the US. So what you see on the left is around midnight, like all the cities are lit. And on the right, you see that there is a bit a difference. Like Toronto, you can't see it anymore, Cleveland, Detroit. Suddenly, in 5 hours, you have a lot of places that are very, very far in space, but that in a coordinated manner have completely shut down. And the reason is that behind this map, what you have is an electric grid. And with an electric grid, if you have an overload in one of the nodes, it can lead to overloads in the neighboring nodes, and it can lead to a cascade of failure in very far distant places. And so this is an example where we talk about like catastrophic failure on a network. So here, without the network, it wouldn't be possible to interpret, but adding the network picture allows to understand this very kind of correlated events at distance. So again, this is less related to space than it is to how things connect. Okay, why do we need network? So I think, do everybody know this piece of art? It's a Volkswagen car. So there's this artist that likes to basically dismantle car and show all the parts. So that's a bit what we've done in physics for the past 2 centuries somehow. We've kind of dismantled the whole world to get to the past, to get to the reductionist approach where you try to go to the atom, to the strings, etc. But basically what this means here is that if I give you that, and I ask you, how does that work? What does it do? What does that whole thing do? You can't have a holistic view on it. You just see all the parts. To have a holistic view on it, you need to understand how these things are connected, how they work together. So there's a whole concept in the network science that it helps to basically not reduce the world, but try to understand how the world emerges, how new things emerge from parts. Another example of why networks are important. Do you know what is the difference between the two?
Atomic structure.
Yeah, it's a structure. So it's basically the lattice of carbon. It's both carbon-based, but the way the carbon is located with respect to one another. So the underlying network that it makes will make a drastic change in the overall emergent properties of these carbon-based elements, diamonds and coal. And so here it's just to give insight that in the network, depending on the way the network is, you can have drastically emergent things such as transparency or opacity, and it can, to other level, it could be other collective phenomena such as the fact that a message can spread very quickly in the network, you can have cascading failure, etc., which are big emergent network properties. And yeah, I reread that a few days back. It's fantastic. It's one of the very, very early days of thinking, how do we connect computers? And in the very early 60s, there were already companies thinking of, okay, tomorrow we're connecting universities, we're connecting computer, but what if there is a nuclear attack? That was the Cold War time. So Paul Baran was in charge of thinking of what is a typical network of computers that can resist an attack. And so he already made different drawings showing, okay, what is a network structure that would fulfill certain properties, and in that case the property was to be resilient and robust to the attack of the nodes. And according to you, what is most robust? Which one would you want to build if you were an engineer? The distributed? Okay, so that's more robust, but would you want to build that today? Would you want it to be distributed? Don't matter. No, because there are hubs.
Yes, I mean, it's kind of...
And why are they hubs?
because they are mixed, because...
But also imagine you have to send a message between two computers in that system.
It's not optimal.
It's absolutely not optimal. So somehow you want a trade-off between being able to transmit messages very quickly and being able to be robust if there is one computer that is somehow destroyed or whatever. So on the left you have the case where it's all centralized. So if I'm a terrorist, basically I know how to destroy that very easily. On the right, it's very resilient to terrorism, but it's not very functional. And in the middle, you have kind of this middle ground. And what's very interesting is that we have converged pretty much to the middle one in a kind of self-organized, natural way. But so that was to show that networks are interested in terms of, as well, in terms of how well they can function in the world and how robust they can be to failures. And last thing I want to show about why networks is a recent paper in medicine. And so it's not only just physics that I was talking about these ideas of reductionism and holism, but medicine has been also pretty much the same than in physics. There were diseases, and so we've been kind of like diving into more precisely into where the disease is from until we hit the genes, and then we say, oh, that's because of that gene. And we kind of, it's a bit like saying in physics, everything is because of the string and string theory, etc. So you kind of have this very big reductionism, the molecular reductionism. And on the opposite, now we know that everything interacts in your body. So your protein interacts, we call that the interactome, but also you interact with other people and you interact with your environment. And each of these layers of complexity interact with the other one. So for example, the way you behave in your social networks, the way the kind of people you have around you, the stress you have, etc., will influence the way your proteins interact, and in return, the way the protein interacts will reflect on your personality, the way you behave to others, etc. So there's all these complex loops, and to have a real view of all that, you need to really think of network, how each layers, how things interact across the layers and with the other layers. So that's kind of where we are now in networks, and that's why we kind of look at networks. Now I wanted to take the opportunity to see how we arrived to, in the science, in the history of science, how we arrived to working with networks. And so I don't know how many of you know about the bridges of Königsberg. Yes, we have one network scientist here that knows. Liuba, you know the bridges. So we have two people that know. Okay. So that was actually in the 18th century, and there was a problem. So the problem is in Königsberg, which is a city, the capital of East Prussia, here, there are bridges around the island in the middle. So you have this island and you have a bridge. You had actually 7 bridges, I think. You have several pieces of land, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bridges. And there was a mathematical problem, which was, can you cross all the bridges without bridging, without going on the same bridge twice? So for example, you cannot go back once you've crossed the bridge. So you cannot go back between 2 nodes. And the people were asking, is there a solution where you can cross everything without going back through the bridge like another time? And to represent that, the mathematician Euler, what he did was he abstracted the problem to a graph like that, and just found that it was very simple to say the problem is that for any graph, for any network, the problem cannot be solved. You have like all the nodes that have an odd number of links, so the ones that have like 1, 3, 5, 7, etc. 7, etc. They have to be endpoints of the network, so that you can go out of them in another way. And here, basically, there was no node that was, all nodes were endpoints, so there was no node you could pass through that was in the middle. So he just basically did a graphical representation of the problem using something that looks like a graph. And what people realized after is that this representation, which is at the bottom here, you can apply it to anything. You can apply it to proteins that interact. You can apply it to actors that are in the same movie. You can apply it to computers that are connected together, etc. So it's this graph, this representation can be then applied to anything that interacts. And so there's been several cases in the past century and a half where people have kind of unveiled network and graphs. So one, and we have specialists of neural anatomy here, but one of them is through the discovery of neural networks. So Golgi invented the stain of neurons to be able to show them in black, and along with Raman Ikaral, they won the Nobel Prize to discover that neurons would connect with one another. And that's been leading to the nervous network theory and what was called cable theory, the fact that there is this cabling inside us. So that was kind of the first example of looking at anatomy in the sense of connection. Obviously, on the social network side, there's been a lot of attention as well to network, because this is an obvious network, how we connect to each other. And what's funny is that if you're with a physicist crowd, nobody knows about these things usually. But if you're social science crowd, everybody knows that, because it's one of the very, very early studies of management theory in management. And what they looked at, it was in the 1920s. There was a plant called Hawthorne plant, and they wanted to know what makes the workers happy and work well. In 1920s, right? And they used network science for that. So they were like, is it the way the lighting is made? Is it like the way we put the lamps? So they had a whole thing about like the exposure, the environment, the way you put the chairs, etc. And then they asked other things. They asked, what are your friends? Who do you trust? Who do you don't like? How much do you share things with your manager? So they asked things about the social network. And what they found out is that the best predictor of like the happiness in for the workers was actually the social network and not the environment so much. So it was like how much they could trust the manager, could exchange things with them, what was the density of your social interaction in the workplace, etc. So it was a very, very early use of social science and networks for better understanding organizations. Social scientists looked at classroom as well. So this is from 1934, what was called a sociogram. So it was not called a graph or a network, it was called like graphical social representation. And here what you have is a classroom, and you ask each student who do they want to sit next to. So they have to choose two persons. And so you have in the circles are the female, and the triangles are men, right? Are boys and girls. And so that's the old version. I don't like very much this layout. So I found on the internet somebody did a new layout with modern tools. And basically, in 1934, he followed for 6 years. So do you see what's happening? Can you tell something from what you see here? So orange is the girls, and white is the boys. So that's an example of social segregation. Actually, it's a process where you have homophily. So homophily in network science means that you will be attracted by nodes that have the same attributes than you. So here it's the gender. And as you see in the beginning, nobody really cares. And then you have two things happening. You segregate with the same sex, right? So you have like these islands and the 6th grade of just boys and just girls. And also you see you're making these big chains because you begin to have your best friend. And so you have a reciprocal relationship. That best friend is not connected anymore to many other people. You begin to have this kind of... So you see how just a network here, you look at it and you understand so many things. You don't even have to do a survey, you don't have to do anything anymore. Just look at that and everything is very clear. So it has benefited a lot, the social science, and there's been theories since then that's been, yes?
Mark, how do you explain the disappearance of the big hubs?
Yeah.
That's very strange.
Yes, I agree. I don't know why there is a hub in the very
Do
beginning.
they have an interpretation for that? Or?
I mean, I would say that in the beginning you pick people by their prior popularity.
No.
So you arrive at school and you're like, oh, that person looks popular, I want to sit next to the popular one. And then you build friendship, yet you realize that the popular one doesn't give you anything in return. so then you pick a random person and you're like, okay, you're officially my best friend for 6 years.
So it's the duration for which they have been together more than the age, because
So I haven't looked at the data actually of like how much you stick with the same person across the years, but you can see though that it's less and less dense. So people are choosing less and less diverse people. They begin to stick to that one person. So I would say that the process probably that you end up having best friendships. And also the process is that you ask them to nominate 2 people. And so if they have one best friend also, it might, there can be noise based on the fact that then they choose somebody a bit random. So it can be the most popular person or something like that. So the process itself might create something with the network. But you can read the paper, 1934. Okay, Granovetter, the social scientists, 1973, one of the most cited papers in network science. And one of the best title of papers ever, The Strength of Weak Ties. Usually it's like in philosophy, it works very well if you have this kind of like oxymoron or like this kind of opposite things in the title. The Strength of Weak Ties it's actually a pretty long paper by Granovetter. And what his claim was that in a social network, you have very strong ties to a closed circle, but then you have weak ties to people that have strong ties here far from you. So let's say, for example, Sepand. Well, so I have strong ties with like some friends, etc. And then I met Sepand, and suddenly I'm arriving in a new area. He's got a whole artist network, co-workspace network, etc. that I did not know. And so he allows me to arrive at a big set of information that I didn't have before. So the strength of quick tie is saying that it doesn't have to be a strong friendship, but we have a lot of these weak ties that allow us to access resources outside of our core group. So it's a model of how we can we don't have to have a big Dunbar number, we don't have to have a lot of people we know very well, but we have to know a few people that could allow us to access other specialized resources. And the last thing in social science, and I think all of you have heard about that, It's the 6 degrees of separation. So it's one thing that makes network science very known. So we're in a social network, and the claim was that there is, with anybody around the world, there's 5 people in between us. So we know someone that knows someone that knows someone that knows someone that knows that person we want to reach. That's the concept of the 6 degrees of separation. And the thing is that it was checked 2 times. It was checked in 1969 by Milgram. So Milgram is a known psychologist and social scientist of the time. And what he did is that he gave people a letter, and he said, you have to send this to that person. And he gave the name of the person, and you know nothing about who is that person, or like how to reach that person. And so the people had to send the email to somebody they knew that potentially could know that person. And so they had a few information about what was the job of the person, or how they could maybe reach it. And so then he gave that to a few hundred people that accepted to be involved. And then he counted the number of stamps the letter had. So how many times the letter had been resent to a friend.
The same letter.
The same letter, each time you have to resend. Keeping the envelope. And so he counted that. And this is a distribution of the number of stamps that there have been. So the number of intermediaries that there have been between the sender and the receiver. And what he found is that on average, you have, if you take the average of that curve, you have 5 people in the chain. So there's 6 degrees of separation because there's 5 people in between you and the receivers. And it was checked more recently with Facebook data. So looking at your friends and the friends of your friends, etc., they looked at how many steps away you're from anybody in the USA only or worldwide. And so as you see, worldwide, the average is about 5 people of separation. So it's literally like a high big data reanalysis of the Milgram story. So there's been interest in social science. Oh yeah, do you know Kevin Bacon? The Kevin Bacon story? Have you seen that before? No? So that's the Bacon number. Yeah. So based on the 6 degrees of separation, there was a concept that if you look at the fact that 2 actors have been in the same film, you can create a link between them, saying, oh, I co-starred with you, I was in the same movie than you. So here is a small network of who played with Kevin Bacon. And actually, Kevin Bacon is a complete hub of that network. Everybody has somehow played with him or played with somebody that played with him, because he would have little roles in thousands of movies. And nobody knows him, but he's been there in all movies. So there's a thing that is called the Bacon number, which is the number of steps away you're from Kevin Bacon if you're in a movie. And usually, everybody has one, because he's really filmed with so many people. So, and for example, Laszlo Barabasi, who's a network scientist, has a Bacon number of 1, and there's another number, which is the Erdős number, who's a mathematician, that you have a number with him if you did a paper with someone that did a paper with him, etc. And so he's the only one to have both numbers very low, because he's a scientist and he filmed a documentary about network science with Kevin Bacon. Okay, so there was social science. At the same time, around the same time in the 60s, you had the beginning of importing a lot of these network concepts to biology. So Monod and Jacob, they are French, they won the Nobel Prize, and that was one of the first examples of having networks in biology. So in biology, you have genes that are produced by DNA, and these genes produce, that are on the DNA, and these genes produce protein that can interact with other protein and regulate them. So you end up having a wiring diagram, as you see here, of how things are interconnected in your own cell. So we're not talking about nervous cells connected to each other anymore. We're talking that inside a given cell, the proteins are also connected with one another in something that looks pretty much like an electric circuit. And there's been a lot of follow-up in that direction, especially now there's a whole field called bioinformatics that looks a lot, and network biology that looks a lot into that. One of my heroes, because he's the reason why I did network science, is Stuart Kauffman, who's a theoretical biophysicist, and he wrote that amazing book in the 90s called The Origins of Order to try to understand how with networks, we can understand a lot about organization process in nature, in biology in particular. And his networks, I love because that's kind of very Windows 95 networks. But his networks are a bit particular because they are networks of, not of things, but of the overall state of something. So let's say, for example, we're all silent right now and I'm the only one speaking. So that's one node in that network says, we're all silent and I'm the only one speaking. And after that, you speak, that's another node. So that looks at like how dynamically the state of the whole network changes in time. And that's a network of states. And more recently, there's been in biology a whole map of what's inside of our cell, which is the interactome. So here, a node is a protein, and there's an interaction between two proteins. There's a link if there's an interaction between two proteins in the cell. And the red points are the cases where if you kill the gene responsible for that protein, the animal is killed. I mean, here it's a yeast, so it's a single cell animal. It's a very small unicellular organism. And you have a very complex set of interaction. You have some hubs, and you have this also link between the fact that if a node is very central to that network, then the organism tends to die because of the centrality of and the importance of the protein. And finally, network science wouldn't be what it is without the famous Erdős, the Erdős of the Erdős number, and Rényi. Erdős is amazing because he's the first nomad scientist. He would take his suitcase and he would knock on the door of other mathematicians or anybody, and he would say, hello, I can solve problems, do you have a problem? And then they would make a paper. So I love it. So he's the most prolific mathematician, still to date, I think. And this is one of the projects that he did on the side. You know, one of his 500 projects was to invent graph theory with Rényi. And so when mathematician took place, and we have one here, basically they were like, okay, networks, the social scientists, you're very nice, etc., you make nice drawings, but let's make some quantitative things. And what they looked at was, if you take nodes in a network and you begin to add links in the network, so you begin to add randomly connections, what happens? And here what you see is that in the beginning you have very few connections, and in purple you have an island that is more connected. So you have what is called the giant component. Like these purple nodes are all connected together. And as you add links, there's a moment, very suddenly, and that's when the curve goes very up, suddenly everything gets connected together. So you add links, nothing is really connected, and suddenly you have a giant component that explodes and where everything is connected together. So they had mathematical proof that this existed, and that was the first kind of intuition of a network grows in time, and as it grows in time, suddenly you can have stuff you didn't expect at all that happens, and everything gets connected. And we will go back to that a bit later. And in the late 90s, that's the moment where network science became super popular because the physicists arrived. Yay. That's me. But that's not me, but I'm a physicist. Okay, and so the physicists, it's a bit like in a follow-up of Erdős-Rényi work, they were like, okay, let's take, they did what physicists do. You know, when we want to model, for example, if we want to model a cow, we say let there be a spherical cow in space, because we make very crude model and very, very approximative things. I mean, we boil down to the essential. And here, what they wanted to understand was why in general there's very few steps of separation between things. Why is there small worlds? Why do we have these connections that are very far? And what they did is that they said, okay, in physics, the networks that we know tend to be very regular networks. Like, for example, the carbon or lattice, or you usually consider things that are just connected to their spatial neighbors. So that's the concept still that things that connect should be spatially connected somehow. And then they said, what happens if you just take some of these connections, that's the middle thing here, and you rewire them, you bring them somewhere else, and until you kind of rewired everything. And what they found is that in that middle range, you have a network where the nodes are very clustered, so that the green curve means it's the neighbors of your neighbors know themselves, so you have still very tight groups, but the distance to reach anybody else in the network, which is this purple curve, is very small. So they said that's a very simple process where you still keep very tight connection with people around you, but somehow you can reach anybody that is far very quickly. And so they propose that it would be a good model to understand how social networks are formed, why societies you can spread these mails very quickly to anybody around the world, etc. So that's kind of a short version of history, and if you want a quantification of it, we can look at those papers and how there's been a burst recently in looking at these things. So Granovetter is like 40 years back now, more than 40 years back, and you see there's been a few citations, that's the amount of citation per year, and suddenly, like, internet arrives, the World Wide Web, 1990s, late 1990s, small world phenomenon, the physics papers, and then huge increase. Erdős-Rönyi, nobody reads it, nobody reads it, nobody reads it. We call that a sleeping beauty. Like, there's a paper that is awesome, but nobody reads it, and nobody cites it, nobody knows about it. Then it's in the Barabazi Albert paper that is in the late 1990s, big influential paper. Everybody begins to look at it. And that's, even for physics, that's pretty big. If you compare to all the other things in physics, if you compare to the fractals, for example, Mandelbrot, if you compare to the chaos theory that's described like the butterfly effect, or like neural networks, etc., all these things, they have risen. And you see then people kind of get used to it and they continue looking at it. And you see networks in the past only 20 years. And it's not even done yet. If you look, it's all the fields, natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, you have more and more work looking at networks. There's more money involved, so more and more grants since the 2000s, more and more money for each grant being given to network science projects. And if you look even with not just physics and going really beyond, and you look at Google Books, so this is for each year the proportion of books in Google Books that contains a given term. This is evolution, so became quite popular after Charles Darwin, late 19th century, and then steady. Quantum mechanics, it arrives in the 1920s, and then it stays there. And you see the rise of networks since the early 20th century, so you have already those works here in neuroscience, you have the works in biology and sociology, and then you have internet arrives here, so you have like this steady growth of the consideration of networks arriving, like before cybernetics, before internet, before all these things. So we see how much of a preparation of an exposure there was also to these works prior. Okay, so where is Stefan?
Yeah.
Stefan, okay, now I talk about hubs, so you have to listen. So why are they hubs? Because I told you there's networks and everywhere we see networks. But why are they hubs? Why do we make hubs? And so this is for you. I want kind of that you get inspiration for that for your work. Okay, so we saw that network is a virtual representation, okay? And this is an example of a cocktail party. You begin to bump into people, and then you connect with those people, and later on you have connected to many people, so you begin to make that random network. So the random network is what we saw from Erdős-Rönyi, is that you have nodes and they begin to interact together. So you have nothing, like the people arrive at the cocktail party, or we arrived tonight but we knew each other already. And then they begin to encounter one another, so they make these small connections with a few people that they've met, etc. And so the Erdős-Rönyi principle is that at some point, as you make this connection, at some point everybody will begin to know each other through someone. So in the beginning you have just these small islands, and then everybody connects with one another. So that's cool, but the thing is that with that you never get hubs. If we were to be random, if we were to choose everything at random, we would not have hubs. So an example is to say a random network is a bit similar to the road network in the US. You see that most cities, they have more or less the same number of links, plus or minus something. So if you were to look at all the nodes and the number of links that they have, most of them, they have, an average number of links plus or minus something. But now, actually, most networks in nature, and I will show you many examples, are more like the airport network, okay? And the airport network, you have much less constraints on having a hub. And you really want to connect to hubs because it's more practical. And most networks, they have some nodes, a very few, but they have some nodes that have a lot of links. And most of the nodes are very, very few links. So here you have, 1, 2 hubs, and all the other one are very, very small number of links. And so the question that Laszlo Barabazi and Reka Albert asked in 1999 was, everybody has considered something that could create this network, but in real life, we have much more of that. How do we do that? This is an example of the internet. You see it's the same thing. Internet, it has like these big hubs here, and like many satellite nodes. And so, oh yes, that's another video to show you that there are hubs. Okay, so I think you understood that there are hubs. But I think the visualization is very nice. This is the web 20 years ago. So I guess this is Yahoo in the middle or something. And so many people, so they looked at a lot of network and they found that the web network, the actor network, internet, the email network, the mobile call, like the number of people you call, Twitter, Facebook, all of these, they had this property of having hubs. So you see that now there's almost 2,000 networks that have been found and that have this hub property. So it's one of the most clear things you can see in all the networks. And so they made a simple model, and that's one of the most important papers in network science because it's a very, very simple but powerful idea. They said, when you grow a network, you don't just put links at random. You think of, I'm a new person and I arrive here. And I look around and I see, okay, so these two people, okay, so both of them, they seem to be pretty connected as much, so I connect to both of them. And then as you go, the new people that arrive, they see that there's this one person that seems to be connected to a lot of people already. So they will be like, oh, that person looks cool, so I want to connect with you. And as you go, these two initial nodes, people have begun to realize that they are more connected. So everybody that is new begins to connect with them. So there's an effect that it's the same thing if I go on Instagram, I will go and I follow the very popular accounts already because like the popular accounts. Accounts. Just because I know that they will probably convey more information about stuff, etc. And so they propose this concept called preferential attachment, which is a model of how the network grows. And that's an example. So here, each time a new node arrives, it connects to two nodes, but with a probability that is proportional to the number of links that the node already has. So you see that the bigger the node, it means the more links the node has around it. And you see that as you grow with this process, you create naturally hubs because people begin to, it's a rich get richer phenomenon that the people that, like the nodes that already have a lot of links, they will have even more links. And so that's a model that has several, like that can be fit as well. So you have, that's the model basically where you can create those hubs. You can change the parameters to be something which is sublinear, so which doesn't really have hubs. And you can make models that are super hubs, where you can have even bigger nodes. So you can tweak it a bit to fit the fact that we really observe these huge hubs.
And alpha parameter is what here again? It was what? It was not the probability, it was...
Alpha here, I think it's the slope of when the proportion, so it's k to power alpha, the probability to connect to a node. Super simple process.
K to V minus
When the probability that connects to you is k to the power alpha divided by the
The idea with this graph is that there's really no space. So, for example, if you have a long line or a short line, it doesn't matter. What would happen if it were more costly to make a long line? Like if the half person will the other end of the room, I would probably also be interested in making links which are closer.
Yeah.
What would be the structure of the network?
Yeah, so then you have objective function, and it depends a lot on the type of cost function you have. And you can still have hubs. So like, that's a big question actually in neural networks. What is the growth model? Because you have this very long distance, but very few and a lot of short distance, but you need the long distance one to have like the ability to have this. So typically you would have more community structure, which is a kind of network first. Well, there's a whole depending on the cost function, you will have different things, but you can still have hubs, internal hubs, and bridge nodes and things like that. There's Marc Santolini has a lot of papers around that on the growth of city networks, typically, which is a bit the same problem because you make a road and you cannot make so much because it costs a lot of money, but you want to join as many places.
In the case of the airports, it has to be like that, no? Because if you want to make you have these hubs, but there's a cost of flying a plane somewhere. But maybe
for the plane?
Yeah. Like fly a plane for 3 hours, not the same as making the thing fly for 9 hours.
Yeah, and so that's why you have a lot of these intermediate hubs that takes a lot of that are basically refueling hubs. That's yet another thing that because of the resource that you can get the resource by being someone. That's one thing that is hard to create a relationship, and one thing that is you need resources. Like a transportation network is different than, for example, a neural network in the terms of the cost function used. But you're right, so a lot of things that I show are for non-spatial networks. That's absolutely true. Oh, that's a scale-free sonata. So the concept of hubs, and I think that's closer to your concept of hubs, was converted to a sonata, whereas it's a generative sonata. Where the time distribution between events is drawn from that distribution of called scale-free. So you have these bursts. That's not very nice to listen to. It's composed, so I don't know how much it's supposed to be inspired from scale-free. I don't know how much is generative and how much is composed. I know the name of the composer, so we can look more, but that's definitely, I'm sure we can do better. Voilà, and as I told you, the concept of hub, in the end, it traces back, at least for this kind of idea that you connect more to the hub during time. It's very linked to this concept of rich gets richer. Well, like that's the more you already have, the more you're going to have in the future. And it's mostly in economics, mathematicians, sociologists, before it came to the kind of like network science world. Okay, and a few last things about networks that are just cool in general that we also look at. As I told you before, the robustness of network is important if you have an attack. So this is a famous paper looking at how would you destroy internet. And what it looked at was the fact that if you have a scale-free network, so if you have this hubs property, most of the time if you hit a random node, it won't change the fact that everything is connected together. Because the only way to disconnect things is to hit the hubs. But there's very, very few hubs. So the hubs, they tend to connect everything together. But if you take any node at random, very rarely you hit a hub just because it's rare. So you see an example here. Each time it's a node taken at random, you get rid of it, and then you end up with still something connected. And the only way to disconnect into many islands would have been to select the hubs with a prior knowledge. So the Achilles heel of the internet, the idea was to say, internet is robust to random attack, but if I know what are the hubs, I can destruct it super quickly. I just need to know in advance what are the hubs. And that's what they do for terrorism, for example. They don't care about destroying part of the network because they know it's still going to be cohesive. What they really need to know is what is the hub. What is the person that is joining all the other one? What is the high centrality person? And that's why the terrorists usually actually counter that by having networks that are very, very decentralized and that are super robust and very redundant on like the way nodes are connected. So it's a kind of a cat and mouse game. Other properties of the network for seconds, the hubs. The hubs sometimes don't like each other, because if you're two hubs and you're connected to each other, if one hub explodes, that puts a lot of risk to the other hub. So they tend, for example, here in the East, the hubs can be very far from each other. This is what is called dissortative nature of the network. Other properties of the network, and we talked about communities. Do you know the karate club? The network scientist knows. Network scientist knows. The Zachary Karate Club was a karate club where they asked who people are friends with. And actually, so that karate club ended up having a scission, like a separation. But it ended up making two karate clubs because there was two professors that didn't like each other. And so you ended up having two big communities. And the question was, from the initial friendship, could you see that coming? Could you see that there was this underlying nature of social interactions? And so that has led to what is called community detection, where you try to find groups of nodes that tend to like each other a lot compared to the rest of the network. So these guys always hang together, these guys seem to always hang together, etc. And it has become very famous because today, detecting communities is one of the biggest things in social network analysis. I'm on Facebook, I want to understand what is your work community, what is your friendship community, I want to begin to cluster things together. And there's a trophy now that is given to any person that runs a community detection algorithm on the Zachary Club at a conference. So at a conference, the first person that has shown a slide doing something with that network wins that trophy, which is called Zachary's Karate Club. So it's a club of people that has a trophy of the Zachary's Karate Club. And this is important for a lot of things. Do you know what this could be? If you guess what this network is, what is this network?
Two families at a wedding.
Two families at a wedding. That's not bad, that's not bad. Yes, it could be it with the people in the middle that would be like the husband.
It's a bad wedding, it's going to end terribly.
Yes. Or not, actually. People are fine. So it's Belgium, and it's the phone call in Belgium. So each link, so each node is a community of at least 100 people that live around a tower, a cell tower. And the color is the language spoken. And it's between red if it's very Flamand, and green if it's very French. And intermediate if it's in between the community. And what you see is that Belgium is really two languages, and in the middle you have Brussels. The community in the middle that is at the junction is speaking both languages, so it's more dark. And so that's an example where you really see, you don't even need a map, you really just see, visualizing that Belgium is not super unified in terms of social network. Okay, what is that? Okay, so it's... What do you mean? Now, this one is political blogs, and the color is depending on the affiliation of the blog, whether it's left or whether it's right. So that's been at the in the US, and it's been at the center of like the bubble effects, and that we know that very well now since Trump election. That whatever you say and whatever you feel that everybody's saying, it's because you're in the middle always of one of those two bubbles, and you never can escape it. You never know what others are saying on the other side anymore on social media. Okay, last one, and that's because we're in France. Do you know what this network is? Les Misérables, ouais. It's the co-occurrence of two characters of Les Misérables in the same chapter. Okay? And that's another thing that is used a lot as an example to show like highly correlated communities, basically, like the different families and what is centrality in the network. Valjean is a hub, it's central to all the communities. So it's another case, for example, of use of network science in humanities for visualizing emergent like social network from a book here. Okay, and a few other pictures. Okay, neurons, neural network, we've been there. medicine, biology, we've been there. So all that is in the past 20 years, a lot of interest. Flavor network. Do you guys know the flavor network? It's awesome. You create a connection between two food, okay, like butter, oil, whatever. If they share a lot of compounds, like, I don't know, fats, you boil down to the compounds that are in the ingredients, and you link two ingredients if they have the same compounds. And so that's really cool. So actually we can't see a lot. Here you have cream, provolone, mozzarella cheese, you have all the cheese here. You have milk here, butter, onion, garlic here, egg, wheat, cayenne, black pepper, etc. So it's kind of a way to explore what you could replace in a recipe. For example, instead of using something, what is the next thing that is around that you can use, and you can make fusion based on that, because you have also like things from all around the world. So that's more like a fun network, but pretty useful if you're running a business where you have food. So next time you can make pasta
I
salad.
will give it to the chief.
Disease network. You link two diseases if they have the same genes that cause the disease. If they, like for example, autoimmune diseases, they tend to have a lot of genes that are affected in common. So there would be like a blob here. So that's an amazing thing for doctors in order to know, well, I can't cure that disease, but I know that it's very close to another disease. So I might try the same drug, or I can try to repurpose certain drugs for other diseases. Militaries, now they make networks that are very readable, where this is a network used during the Afghan war to describe what is the tactics, the strategies, the way to work with the local people, how does these things make an ecosystem of, you know, like a complex ecosystem of action. And I guess that was to argue that their job is difficult, that was they're not succeeding. But so that's an example of using networks for kind of better understanding your mode of strategy, mode of action. Mapping organization, that's much more recent in the same kind of line that Hawthorne studies. That's, the this one is pretty fun. That's communities. This is an organization in Hungary, 3 different locations. They ask the people to nominate what is the one person they go to if they need help. Okay? So a very big node is a hub. It's like it's the one that has the highest degree. So the board of directors, it's the red people here. So nobody cares about them. You see that they're here, but they're very random. So the gray person here is the person that has the highest degree. And what is very interesting is that this person is absolutely not a director. It's absolutely not a manager. It's somebody that travels a lot to go to the different teams and somehow like check if everything is all right, etc. And the thing is that because the company doesn't disseminate well the information, everybody trusts that person to say what the others are up to and what's, you know, what they should do, how they should behave, etc. So that person has become much more important for everybody than the director of the company. And you see that 2 steps away of that person, here in red, you reach almost half of the company already. So that's an example to show that even for human organizations, with the use of network, you can better understand who the people trust, you know, who they want to refer to, and it's not necessarily the hierarchy. It can be somebody, you know, that you would not expect at all. So the question is, would you fire that person if you were the director, or would you promote that person? It's a big question. Other use of network. We talked about the transportation network. We talked about the plane network. So this is from the Vespiniani lab, and the specialty is epidemics. So here, H1N1 epidemics 2009, they made a model very early to predict how it would spread and when it would peak across the world. And the way they do that is that they have a mathematical model that takes into account how planes fly from one city to another and the probability that a person gets sick, how many people you're going to encounter in the new city, the density of population, etc. And they predicted that the peak would be around October, and the peak was indeed in November. They did that 9 months in advance. So that allows to kind of predict, forecast the epidemics, where it's going to happen, and how you could prevent it, and which airport you should target. So that's another use of networks for kind of prediction of epidemics. And yeah, just to finalize, before we play a little game, A lot of this material can be found in this very good book that you have an interactive version on the web. So if you want to go further in those concepts, see the actual mathematics of it, or just see nice visualizations and video, you can go there. There's tons of other books, all of them kind of playing around the world connection network, but without saying it, all from the big scientists from, I can share the slide after. And network games, so now to kind of put something more concrete to all these slides that you have seen, what we wanted to do was to make a little network game. So it's not a game where you're going to win something, it's a game where you're going to learn something, and you're going to be interactively part of a network and understand the concept. And it's just a 10 minutes game, and we're going to film it. And so the rule of the game is going to be explained by Liuba, who's the head of the network game experiment.
So we have this envelope, and in the envelope we have the nodes with the numbers on them. We will distribute these numbers to all of you. Everyone will get a number, and this is basically the number of your node. So there are around, I think I counted like around 19 people here who were counted. And this is your number in this game, so you will get this number. And on the other side of this number, there is a personal information which you do not distribute to anyone. So you do not say anything what is written here, basically, only here. And what is written on that side is basically whom you are connected to. You can be a hub, or you can be actually a person who has only one connection. And we do not know who is a hub here or not. And we do not know actually anything about this. And the role of this, the main goal of this game is actually to distribute the message as fast as possible in this network. So we can play it for now like this, and we will see what happens, because it's quite nice what happens at the end. That
what's the message?
well, we can spread something like we can spread the red scarf or something like this, but we also have the thing which we prepared here, which is this. We just need to distribute something, like a message. A message in the case of internet network, it can be like a real message, or but it can be something like physical.
Okay.
So it's not the message like when you play the broken phone. Yeah, it's not the information, it's just something physical.
Okay.
So
Who wants
how
to
many?
participate?
Yeah, who wants to play? It's very fast. It's just maximum 10 minutes. So Marc,